Here's the main subject that Johann Joseph Fux used to teach fugue in the final section of his counterpoint treatise, Gradus ad Parnassum. The subject is composed from the first 4 notes of the Dorian Cantus firmus that Fux had used to teach counterpoint from the very beginning of the book. This is a good fugue subject because it works in stretto in 2 different ways. Strettos are essentially short canons formed by the fugue subject and answer. The first stretto is a canon at the lower 5th or upper 4th, with the answer leading and the subject following at a distance of 2 measures. The second stretto is a canon at the upper 5th or lower 4th, with the subject leading and the answer following at an even closer distance of only 1 measure. Fux then composes this 2-voice fugue using the Dorian subject and its 2 strettos. The most basic rule of fugue is that a voice can only make an entrance using the fugue subject or answer. So, fugues are traditionally analyzed in terms of their entry groups. The first entry group is more commonly referred to as the exposition, which introduces all the participating voices and the different forms of the subject and answer. In this case, the alto enters with the subject in measure 1, and the soprano enters with the answer in measure 4. The alto voice continues beneath the soprano in florid 5th species counterpoint, and all of the florid counterpoint in this video will be written in red note heads, while subjects and answers will appear in black. In some fugues, the counterpoint that supports the answer and subject entries takes the form of a recurring theme called a countersubject. But a fugue that does not have any recurring countersubjects, like this one, is called a simple fugue. Future videos in this series will cover the other, more advanced kinds of fugue. In the second entry group, Fux changes the rhythm of the subject and answer slightly by shortening the first whole note of the theme to a half note. This type of rhythmic alteration is more common for Renaissance vocal fugues than it is for more modern instrumental ones. The middle entry group, or groups, are usually given much more liberty than the beginning or the end of a fugue. Entries can appear in different keys and do not need to be so systematically organized. Notice that whereas the alto took the subject during the exposition, here in the second entry group it takes the answer, and likewise the soprano, which earlier had the answer, now takes the subject. These entries also use the first of the 2 strettos that I showed a moment ago. The final entry group of a fugue is where the strettos can usually be found. Many fugues only have 1 kind of stretto, so it would be found here near the end. This fugue has 2, so Fux saves the tighter and more impressive of the 2 strettos for the conclusion. Everything in between the entry groups is called an episode, or sometimes a digression or interlude. The 2 episodes that Fux composes for this fugue are entirely composed out of free, florid counterpoint. Fugues need episodes to give the listener some relief from the fugue subject. Even a short piece like this one would become very tiring for the listener if the subject occurred in every measure. In my opinion, the most difficult aspect of composing fugues is coming up with convincing episodes that sound like a fluent continuation of what came before, but that also provide a variety that the main materials can't provide on their own. Most episodes are built out of sequences, as Fux does here by sequencing this new melodic motive. The sequence leads into a cadence on scale degree 5 on the downbeat of measure 10. And even though this isn't a full modulation, this articulation of another key area breaks up the monotony that would have resulted if we'd simply jumped straight into the second entry group. The second episode is mainly built out of a sequence of decorated 2-3 suspensions, and it cadences on scale degree 3 in measure 20. Finally, a little bit of florid counterpoint at the very end allows Fux to compose the strongest cadence of the piece on the final tonic. Let's listen to the two-voice fugue. Later on, Fux uses the same subject to compose a three-voice fugue. The exposition is basically the same as that of the two-voice fugue, but this one now includes a tenor entry with the subject in measure 7. There is no episode between the first and second entry groups. The alto states the answer in measure 10, and the soprano takes the subject in stretto in measure 12, while the tenor continues in florid counterpoint. At this point, all we need is some sort of entry in the tenor voice, and the second entry group will be complete. But Fux doesn't just give us that entry immediately in stretto with the others. When composing fugues, it is easy to get focused entirely on the process and forget that we are still trying to compose not just a good fugue, but good music, first and foremost. Rather than rushing to the next step in the process, Fux lets the composition breathe a little. This is where he chooses to place the first episode. I represented this episode with dashed brackets because I think of it as something of a soft boundary within the fugue. Everything from the beginning of the second entry group until this episode can be termed counter-exposition because it remains in the tonic key and directly reacts to the statements of the exposition. One of the older Latin terms for this was the repercussio, repercussion or rebound. The alto and soprano stretto entries are directly connected to the entries of the exposition. But when the episode starts, the second entry group still has unfinished business. We still expect a statement of the subject or answer in the tenor voice. There is no rule in fugal composition that every entry group, especially middle entry groups, need to have a complete statement in every voice once and only once. But there is the principle in polyphonic music of the equality of voices that causes us to expect the tenor to receive a statement at some point in order to play on an equal footing with the other two voices. There's an old cliché that fugue is not a musical form, it is a process, and I think that this is a good example. For these reasons, we often distinguish between the counter-exposition, whenever there is one, and the middle entries that occur after the first episode. Fux first gives a statement of the subject to the alto in measure 17, which shows a new way of harmonizing the subject, and then the tenor voice finally does enter with the answer in measure 20. After this, a short episode leads us into the final entry group of tight strettos. The subject in the bass and the answer in the alto have been rhythmically shortened to fit within 3 measures, but the soprano statement of the subject has been stretched to last for 5. These rhythmic changes look drastic when written on the page, but the theme remains clearly recognizable to the ears. The biggest cadence in the piece is still the final cadence on the tonic, where all three voices come to a strong melodic and harmonic closure. Compared to the two-voice fugue, we see that Fux places a cadence on the tonic in measure 10 at the end of the exposition. We can form this kind of cadence anytime our fugue subject has a clear descending whole step, also known as a tenor cadence. In measure 13, we see our first example of a deceptive cadence. The bass voice resolves the G-sharp leading tone upwards to A, while the alto moves down by step from B to A, forming a clausula vera, and giving each of those voices strong melodic closure on scale degree 5. But at the same time, the soprano statement of the subject leaps to the note F, contradicting the other two voices and creating a beautiful sense of forward motion and continuity. The bass statement at the end of the middle entries allows for a cadence in measure 23 that is almost a direct copy of the one that happened back in measure 10, but now transposed into the key of the dominant. Fuchs's episode after this entry also prepares a cadence on scale degree 3, just like back in the two-voice fugue. But here, he again manages a very nice deceptive motion by placing the bass entry of the final strettos at the same moment that the soprano and alto cadence on F. Notice that this bass entry is all the more striking because it was preceded by nearly 4 measures of silence in the bass voice. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, as they say. Now let's listen to the three-voice fugue. Fuchs's four-voice fugue on the same subject doesn't change things too much other than the possibility of four-voice part writing. I say the possibility of four-voice writing because when we actually look at the piece, we notice that Fuchs doesn't use all four voices together all that often. Most of the time, one or two of the voices are resting. This is important in vocal music to allow the singers time to breathe, but it is also important even in instrumental fugues. As I noted earlier, thematic entrances stand out much more crisply when they are preceded by rests. The first entry group proceeds similarly to those of the other fugues, but now Fuchs introduces the voices in the order alto, soprano, bass, and tenor. The tenor entrance in measure 10 happens at the same moment as the first tonic cadence, which is another way to create a sense of continuity across cadential boundaries. Then a counter-exposition begins almost immediately. The soprano enters with a statement of the subject in stretto with the tenor in measure 12, which means that the second entry group actually begins before the first one has ended. Again, fugue is not a form, it is a process. In measure 13, we get the same deceptive cadence as happened here in the three-voice fugue, and the alto enters immediately in stretto with the soprano. Here we once again get an internal episode that separates the two entries of the counter-exposition from the remaining two middle entries that we expect to take place in the tenor and bass. Those entries do in fact take place in stretto in measures 19 and 20. The final entry group reveals the tight stretto, first in the alto and soprano, and then in the bass and tenor. With all that in mind, let's now listen to the four-voice fugue. For the last part of the video, I would like to provide a tutorial on how to compose a four-voice simple fugue in the manner demonstrated by Fux. I will use as a subject the first four notes of the Cantus firmus by Johann Joseph Fux that I've been using in most of the Counterpoint videos on this channel. We can form a real answer by transposing the subject to begin on scale degree 5 in C major. And, just like the Fux example, this subject happens to work in two different strettos. Now, the fugue I am about to compose is not exactly a banger, and part of the reason is this rather dull subject that I've chosen. Most good fugue subjects have an interesting rhythm or distinctive melodic shape that makes them memorable. But my intention is that you will focus with me on the process of composition rather than the quality of the result. For what it's worth, I give you my permission to compose as many boring fugues as you need to while you are learning the process. I'm going to compose the entry groups first, separately, and only then join them together with episodes. It is also possible to compose a fugue from beginning to end, but I think it's more instructive if I demonstrate a long-term plan. Here's my plan for the exposition. The voices enter alto, soprano, bass, and tenor, alternating subject and answer. When it comes to the order of voice entries, there are two big considerations. First, we don't want any large registral gaps in the texture as the voices are introduced. So, for instance, if we had our hearts set on starting with the subject in the bass and then the answer in the soprano, that would be difficult because those two voices would likely be pretty far apart from one another. You can introduce non-adjacent voices, but at any one moment the voices should try to stay within a range of about a tenth from one another. Secondly, notice that the alto and bass take the subject, while the soprano and tenor take the answer. This means that the voices form an interlocking pattern of subject and answer. Pairing the voices in this way, or taking the converse pattern, makes composing the exposition much easier, because the alto lies within a comfortable range about an octave distance above the bass, and the soprano also lies a comfortable range situated an octave above the tenor. An unbalanced pattern like this one is possible, but it can lead to spacing problems. For instance, should the soprano and alto both take the subject beginning on the same pitch, or should they enter an octave away from one another? The same question for the answer in the tenor and bass voices. Just make things easy for yourself by picking an entry pattern that allows the subjects and answers to alternate between the voices. With the voices penciled in, completing the exposition will be no more difficult than continuing the voices that have already entered the texture in florid counterpoint until the end of the tenor statement. The fugue subject is going to serve as a sort of cantus firmus that migrates throughout the texture for us to compose around. Needless to say, if you have not learned how to compose florid counterpoint in four voices, then you will want to master that skill before tackling fugal writing. Let's focus first on composing a soprano line for this segment, up until the bass entry in measure 7. On the downbeat of measure 7, we already have the notes C and G, which form the root and fifth of a C major triad. So our alto line should pretty clearly aim for the chordal third E on the downbeat of measure 7, a tenth above the bass. I came up with this. For measures 7 through 10, we need to continue the soprano and alto lines above the ascending bass, and we should aim for another complete C major triad on the downbeat of measure 10. I decided a natural way to harmonize this ascending bass would be with a pair of 6/3 position triads, like this. Let's listen from measure 7 through to the tenor entrance on the downbeat of measure 10. For the last segment, we need to harmonize the subject in the tenor voice by composing a bass, alto, and soprano. I'd also like to have the first cadence in the piece somewhere around here, and the best opportunity for one, given the shape of the fugue subject, would be here on the note B, treating it as the third of a tonicized G major triad. I'm imagining a chord progression something like this. There's no need to get fancy in the realization either. We just find the smoothest voice leading to achieve that cadence. Let's listen to the entire exposition. For the second entry group, I decided to organize the entries completely differently, for the sake of variety. The alto and soprano will enter first, with the subject and answer opposite to what they had during the exposition, but this time using the first of the two possible strettos. This will probably grow straight out of the exposition, like the counter-expositions that we saw in the Fux fugues. There will then be some sort of episode, separating the alto and soprano entries from those of the tenor and bass. I left a single measure blank here, but at this point, I had no idea how long the episode would need to be. I wanted the tenor and bass to enter in a key other than C major, in order to show that possibility for the middle entries, since Fuchs did not do so in any of his examples. The tenor enters with the subject on D, and the bass enters in stretto on A, which will suggest the keys of D minor and/or A minor. Since this fugue uses a real answer, it is not possible to distinguish between the subject and answer when it is transposed into another key, so I'm referring to them both as statements of the subject. For the first two entries, I want to find an opportunity for the tenor and bass voices to drop out of the texture, so that their entrances after the episode will stand out more distinctly. Voices typically leave the texture after a cadence. Not necessarily a full harmonic cadence, but at least a moment of melodic closure for those voices that are dropping out. I came up with this: a half cadence on G major as the dominant of C. I'm going to leave the first few measures blank for now, because that area will depend on what I want for the episode that leads into these statements. the tenor and bass entries, as I scan around for opportunities to place a cadence, I notice that it will be difficult to create a cadence in the key of D minor anywhere. So I chose to interpret the phrase in the key of A minor. The third note of the bass statement can support a cadence that resolves to a first inversion A minor triad. This isn't a deceptive resolution, but it is exactly the kind of weak closure that works very well in a fugue. The clausula vera in the alto and soprano will give those voices an opportunity to drop out of the texture, while the lower two voices will continue on into the next episode. Now let's compose the final entry group and the coda that leads to the final cadence. Here I'm using the tightest stretto and overlapping the voices as much as possible within the key of C major. The previous entries took place in the tenor and bass, which is why this last entry group is initiated by the alto and soprano. The order of entries reverses things compared to the exposition. Now the alto and bass take the answer an octave apart, and the soprano and tenor take the subject an octave apart. Unfortunately, this stretto does not lend itself to a particularly strong implied harmonic progression. These measures, for instance, are probably going to have to be interpreted as E minor triads in first inversion, which have a fairly indistinct harmonic character. But that is okay, as long as we avoid any tonic triads, which will increase the anticipation for a cadence and the feeling of being in the middle of a long phrase that will culminate with the final tonic cadence. I came up with this for the harmonization of the stretto itself, ending with an applied dominant seventh chord, briefly tonicizing the key of A minor. Then, all that was needed was a large and emphatic cadence in the tonic C major, for which I composed this three-measure dominant pedal. Let's listen to the final strettos and coda. Now all that remains is to compose the episodes. As I mentioned earlier, I believe this is the most difficult part to do well. Compared to the entry groups, there are almost too many options, and typically, composers will latch onto motives from the main materials to use in constructing the episodes. You will notice that I tried to use this turning motive a few times in the piece, and that helps in unifying things somewhat. Between the exposition and the beginning of the second entry group, I noticed that I did not need an episode at all, but could begin the counter-exposition right as the tenor ends its statement. But I still need to compose a continuation from the tenor and bass in measure 13 to what I have in measure 16. I came up with this. This solution uses an applied dominant seventh chord in measure 15 to prevent a premature closure in C major for the cadence that would have otherwise happened there. Let's listen to measures 13 through 16. In preparing to compose the first episode, I knew that I wanted it to be written for the alto and soprano, while the two lower voices rested. I also knew that I needed to aim towards the D minor triad, that I had already composed for the beginning of the tenor entrance in measure 21. With those two requirements in mind, I came up with this, which places a cadence in D minor at that moment. I decided to make this a deceptive cadence, however, in order to keep the forward momentum of the piece going. I was also able to sneak in an inverted form of the turning motive. Finally, we need an episode that connects the cadence in A minor in measure 25 to the beginning of the final strettos. Again, we have two considerations. The first is that the episode should be mainly carried out by the lower voices, so that the upper voices have an opportunity to rest before the upcoming entrances. The other consideration was the issue of key. The A minor cadence in measure 25 has led us away from the key of C major, and this episode should prepare the return of the tonic key. The problem is, too strong of a tonic cadence at this moment would steal the thunder of the dominant pedal that is coming up after the final strettos, and would make it sound unmotivated. So I composed a relatively weak cadence on the tonic in measure 31. The bass leaps from scale degree 5 to 1, forming a typical bass cadence, but the tenor has a 4-3 suspension. The alto enters with the answer on scale degree 5 at the same moment of the cadence, which further weakens its sense of conclusion. Let's listen to measures 25 through 32. You should now be prepared to attempt to compose a simple fugue of your own, either using a subject derived from the whole notes of a Cantus firmus, or, if you subscribe to my Patreon page, you will find a collection of didactic fugue subjects by various composers that are intended for students to use to compose practice fugues. Link in the description. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section. And if you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's listen finally to the completed simple fugue.